Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Weaving Project-Based Learning into Rigorous High School Courses. My name is Sean Cavanaugh, and I'm an assistant editor for Education Week. Today's webinar has been sponsored by It's Learning. Project-based learning is a practice found in many school districts around the United States these days, and it comes in many different forms. We at Education Week have been reporting on the spread of project-based learning in schools for years now. Project-based learning is defined in different ways, but one way to define it is as an instructional method in which students pick up knowledge and skills by working for an extended period of time to investigate a complex problem or task. But what's the role that project-based learning can play in a course with a demanding curriculum? Today, we'll explore that topic by taking an in-depth look at the Knowledge in Action project. Knowledge in Action has introduced project-based learning into the teaching of advanced placement courses. One of the big goals of the project is to help students learn complex content while engaging them in deep learning and problem solving in a team environment. I'm joined by three guests today who will talk about Knowledge in Action, what they've learned from it, and the implications for K-12 schools around the country. I'll now introduce them. Amber Graber is the Advanced Placement Coordinator of the Des Moines Public Schools in Iowa. She's been using the Knowledge in Action program for several years now, and she'll be able to give us a look at what this project looks like on the ground in a district. Jane C. Lowe is an Assistant Professor of Social Science Education at the School of Teacher Education at Florida State University, and Susan Bobbitt Nolan is a Professor of Learning Sciences and Human Development at the University of Washington. Both Jane and Susan are playing a role in researching the impact of Knowledge in Action program and in trying to determine what impact it's having, how it can be refined and improved over time. I'm now going to put up a poll question for our audience to gain a sense as to what your experience has been with project-based learning and what your views are of project-based learning. I'm going to give you a few moments to respond to that, and while you are, I'm going to go over some of the technical details from this webinar that may help you navigate our system and pose questions to our guests. Please check the audio setting on your computer as well as your speaker volume settings if you're having any audio trouble. If you're still having issues after doing that, please see our detailed audio troubleshooting file available in the resources list under the Q&A window. There are also some other icons that open additional feature panels in our webinar console. You can read about today's speakers in the speaker bio window, click the resources list to download a copy of today's slides, and follow the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag EWWebinar. To submit a question for our speakers, type them in the Q&A box. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. I'm now going to turn things over to Jane Lowe, who will introduce our video, which will provide some background on the Knowledge in Action program. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, so thanks, Sean. As Sean said, this is Jane Lowe. I'm a researcher at Florida State University, and I'm interested in how to refine and implement project-based learning in different school contexts. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. We hope to answer many of your questions about project-based learning in rigorous coursework today. And to start off, we're going to show you a brief 8-minute video that introduces a research project we've been working on for about 8 years called Knowledge in Action. This project will anchor our conversation today, and we hope it serves as a good resource and fodder for your own interests in PBL. To find out more about the project, feel free to check out the website that you see here on the screen, knowledgeinaction.org, and I believe actually a link has been provided to you in the resources page as well. And after the brief video, Amber Graber will talk more about PBL through a teacher and administrator's perspective. Then Susan Nolan and myself will talk specifically about the two courses as examples of how this type of PBL can work for you. So let's get started with the video.
I run the Washington Post.
I ran for president.
I lobby Congress.
We had one student in my former district who dropped out of high school and came to AP Government every day till the end of the year. And he called himself the worst dropout in the history of dropouts because he still showed up. I don't know why he came, but I do. I do know why, because there was a role for him, and he played a part in the classroom learning experience. For him to drop out of high school, but still to come to that class, that was the moment in that first year that changed the way I thought about the course.
What we're working on in the Knowledge and Action project is a way of making advanced high school coursework accessible to more and more children and worth it by making it a deep, rich curriculum that they can take with them into the future.
Do we want to say before or against the Alabama law?
Our interest group would be before this, for the Alabama, because all it is collecting data.
It's hard to collect data when people are not forthcoming. It makes it really hard to get accurate data.
The way we attempt to achieve deep conceptual learning is primarily through a particular kind of rigorous project-based learning. It's not uncommon in an AP course to have a project or two. We're trying to drive the course through projects, which is to say through experiential learning.
2,000 students stopped going to school. Alabama's school system is going to fall apart because there's not going to be government funding.
2,000 students in a state that probably has, what, 10, 13 million, somewhere in there?
How many of those 13 million go to school?
Well, AP Gov is a class that has traditionally been taught in one semester. So in one semester, they fly through all the institutions of government, as well as how they're linked together and how they're linked to the people. And it has traditionally been a very lecture-oriented course because it's a lot of content to get through and not a whole lot of time. The idea came of, well, could we make an entire course in government that really is about how we put kids in the middle of these situations and not how we just tell kids about these situations.
These people that are here illegally, if they're here legally, if we make it possible for them to get a green card, they'll then in turn be paying taxes, they'll be benefiting our society instead of hurting it.
I came on board after the AP US Government and Politics course was in place, and the team wanted to add a second course, AP Environmental Science.
So, the 1%, where's 1%?
Only 4 of them are living.
Everybody understands, all of these brilliant, hardworking teachers that teach AP know that what they need to deliver is a large proportion of their students passing that test. So the most direct route to doing that is to teach to the test. Well, what we're trying to do is figure out a way to drive more learning into that course. So in our courses, students are very often involved in a simulation. In the case of the AP Gov course, they're taking the role of a Supreme Court justice or somebody running a campaign or running for office.
It's not communistic. What he wants to do is reinforce
sharing the wealth among people who didn't earn it.
Reinforce the already existing programs such as Social Security. All we're doing is strengthening the social safety net so that we can have free trade that is also fair trade.
Sometimes you lose the sense of you're in a role, you're not actually really that person, but sometimes you become that person without even realizing it.
So it's different than any kind of class where you would just have a lecture, do a worksheet or an activity, maybe make a poster at the end and take a test. This is structured completely differently so that from the very beginning, students have a role that they play and a need to know.
All these activities are a way for kids to get personally invested in the project, often with the goal of winning or coming out ahead, especially kids who are not already the ones really well suited for traditional AP format classes.
One of the key design principles in the course is this idea of looping.
We ask students constantly to go back and think about what did it mean when you were this, or when you played this role, and what does it mean now in this situation? So we try to get them to make connections by never leaving behind the unit that we taught in the past.
A typical class is just a lot of note-taking and a lot of reading from chapters and then reiterating it back to the teacher. But here you get to apply it in your life and then apply it throughout the year and not just on one test or one essay. That's what makes this class different.
All right, next up. I think the biggest challenge with the curriculum is scaling it to a range of school environments, making it work for urban students, in poverty-impacted schools, and also making it work for more affluent students. So we've tried to select problems in each of the units in the course that can be adapted to different environments. For example, the project about looking at one family's impact on the environment. That's relevant regardless of the environment you're in.
We can measure the amount of recycled material. That's one thing we can measure.
Wait, how would you do this if you live in an apartment? We all live in an apartment.
Oh, don't you guys have like a recycling, like next to the garbage?
We started the curriculum in the Bellevue School District. And the Bellevue School District is a suburban school district located right outside the city of Seattle. Bellevue has quite a range of affluence, but you're looking technically at a wealthier suburban community. In 2011, we brought the curriculum to Des Moines, Iowa. And the Des Moines Public Schools have a free and reduced lunch average of about 65% district-wide. So the majority of our students are in the lower socioeconomic class. When bringing the Knowledge in Action project to a poverty-impacted school district, you're likely to find challenges, including student preparedness for AP coursework, reading skills and reading level, and teacher readiness. And so we've needed to make some changes in order to provide opportunities for them to have success. We don't just want equity of access, entry into the course. We want equity of outcomes. We want our kids in poverty-impacted schools to be just as successful as kids in other areas.
Rashunda started out as one of those students that I don't like to read. I don't want to read. And I've never picked up a book, and I don't want to. And so she went into a reading strategies course last year. Rashunda is like the poster child of a student that didn't like reading and now loves to read, and is now reading advanced placement college material books.
In that class, like, everybody's working, everybody's talking, everybody's in groups, everybody's just active. Like, you don't even want to leave the class when you have to.
This project approach gives you a chance to engage the students who might otherwise sort of sit and hide and keep a low profile and not do well. Their performance is more clear to see, and their success shows more clearly.
The problem-based curriculum that they're using in the AP government class is definitely working. When you walk in, the students are speaking, not the teacher. And so you know that they are learning the material because it's coming out of their mouth.
It's really exciting to see students that may not have traditionally taken an AP course or succeeded in an AP course actually connect with the material in a way that makes them successful on the AP test, of course, but more importantly, impacts their lives and the decisions that they begin to make as adults and even as young adults. I think that's really exciting to feel like you've empowered students in a way that's going to stay with them for years to come. I think that's probably the best part of being involved in something like this.
Well, thanks for taking a look at that video clip. My name is Amber Graver, and my experience with the Knowledge in Action project goes back to about 2007. And so hopefully that video gives you a little bit of context, but my role as a teacher and then as a curriculum coordinator in a mid-sized urban district, I've really seen this project as a positive influence, not just on students, but also on teachers and classroom communities. And it started really with a partnership between the George Lucas Educational Foundation, which is now Lucas Educational Research, or LER, and the University of Washington in Seattle. And the University of Washington completed a lot of the research, and that's what Jane C. Lowe and Susan Nolan will discuss later in the webinar. And I just happened to be teaching in the Bellevue School. So I was a social studies teacher at Bellevue High School in the Bellevue School District out in Washington State. And they approached me as one of the teachers who could participate as a co-designer, along with Adrienne Curtis Dickinson and Catherine Piper, who were at Sammamish High School in Bellevue Schools. And so we got together and we were able to be a part of the design, the original design, with the University of Washington staff, and then also a part of the many iterations over the past 10 years. We've also had an opportunity to really identify Pbl Design Principles, which we will walk through in just a moment, and talk a little bit about the course content. What does Knowledge in Action actually look like in an AP US Government class or an AP Environmental Science course? And then we'll talk about the shifts in teaching and learning. And I do want to reiterate to the public and to those of you listening that even though this was originally tackled in an AP environment, these design principles and these shifts in teaching and learning can apply to many different contexts in schools as a result of what we've learned. And through the process of understanding the principles and the shifts, we've been able to apply this in 7th grade in general ed courses and special education settings. So this works with all students in many contexts. The reason that it was explored in advanced placement was because there's a national exam. And so we could look at some control groups and kind of a quasi-experimental research study so that we could see how do students do in traditional classes that use kind of more of a maybe a direct instruction approach and pedagogy, and what does it look like in AP classrooms that are using project-based learning. So this gives you a little bit of background in terms of my experience, but I think we just talked through most of that, so we can move on to talk a little bit about the design principles. So here's the first design principle. The first design principle that's really important is the idea of projects as the spine. And sometimes Dr. Walter Parker, who you saw in the video from the University of Washington, he'll refer to it as the main course, not the dessert. And so I think when I originally started teaching, I thought I was doing projects. You know, at the end of a unit, I had kids doing great posters, and we would put them up on the wall, and you'd look at them, and I'm not really sure who did them or what they learned, but man, it made my room look really nice. But when I started to become involved in this group, in Knowledge in Action, I realized that projects can be so much more than something that's done at the end as a synthesis of learning, but instead they can drive learning throughout the course. And so in Knowledge in Action courses, projects are the main course, not the dessert. They are the spine. They are what we design our units of instruction around, and we call them project cycles. And in these project cycles, students are given a role to play, and they are tasks with increasingly more complex or cognitively complex tasks to create something that's of meaning, a public product, solve a problem. And we'll talk a little bit and see some examples of those in a moment. Another one of the design principles is looping. And the idea of looping is revisiting core concepts. So as a group of teacher designers, we looked at, in this case, the College Board curriculum framework for AP US Government or AP Environmental Science. If you're doing this in your context, you would look at your state standards or your core standards, and you would say, okay, what are the most important core concepts I need kids to revisit, or core skills I need them to have over and over again so that they can achieve mastery? And we made sure that those were woven in over the entire course, not just in one unit. Another project design principle was engagement first. Engagement first is really about accessing prior knowledge, but it's more than just connecting with kids' prior knowledge in one setting. It's also about giving them what I think is a role to play, a reason to be there. And you heard those students say, you know, I ran for president, I lobby Congress, I work for the NRA. Like, they had a real authentic role to play in these different project cycles so that there was a reason to learn and a reason to know and a reason to do. So instead of students saying, I don't know, why are we doing this? Why are we taking notes on the media in government? They instead had a reason to, because they were playing a part in a simulation or in a project-based cycle or solving a problem like eco-footprint. And so this engagement first principle really helps us connect kids to the curriculum and connect kids to the concepts and skills that they're learning. And then we get into instructional supports. And this is really contextual. Different contexts find different challenges, and we mentioned that in the video as well. When I started this course, I was teaching in a high-achieving school district. Kids were kind of primed to take advanced placement courses. Even though it was linguistically and culturally and ethnically diverse, it wasn't socioeconomically diverse for the most part in this school district, and I had a pretty high-achieving group of students. They struggled with PBL because in the way that they'd been trained was, you tell me what to do, and I will do it. Tell me what I need to do to get a 4 or 5. I will go get a 4 or 5 on that AP test. Well, that's not 21st century learning. That's not even 20th century learning, and that's boring. Plus, in the real world, when you step out of your classroom, you got to talk to people, and you have to work with people, and you have to solve problems. So I had some issues right away at the beginning where I had to coach kids into understanding the importance of teamwork and the importance of working together to solve problems. Then when I moved from that relatively wealthy suburban area into a poverty-impacted school district in Des Moines, we had different challenges. Kids actually, they didn't struggle with the working together part or the idea of solving problems in groups. They struggled more with complex reading, looking at foundational documents and struggling to get through text. So what were some of the instructional supports we were going to put in place there? What does scaffolding look like? What kind of quality feedback can we give to kids? So the instructional supports really vary based on your context, but it deals a lot with scaffolding and a lot with differentiation. And finally, the Pbl Design Principles that we've used as teachers as collaborators, and I can't stress this enough. Knowledge in action is not a script. They are not going to set down in front of you materials that say on day 1 you're going to do X, Y, Z, and then on day 2 we're all doing A, B, C. It doesn't work like that. There is a really great set of resources that can help you as a professional make decisions about your local context and your students and how you want to meaningfully engage them. So we encourage and really we strive on the idea that teachers make adaptations. That next year, for example, when I'm teaching AP US Government and Politics at Roosevelt High School in Des Moines, I'm looking at this first unit in the government curriculum and I'm already making some adaptations because I know that I want to do something a little bit differently. That's not a bad thing. In knowledge and action, that's great, and we share those resources with each other and we help develop even better project cycles each time. Taking you into an example of looping, this just shows you in the government course how we kind of settled as co-designers on what were the core concepts that kids needed to know and understand in order to do well on the AP exam at the end of the year. So we took these core concepts and then we worked on creating project cycles that would loop students through those core concepts. And then we looked at the skills like constitutional reasoning, perspective taking, and close reading. And we also were very intentional about where we put in opportunities for kids to build on those skills. This is what the knowledge and action course looks like when you take a 10,000-foot view. What this does is you can see we have a huge course master question, which essentially is a driving question, or in some cases teachers call it an essential question. We just wanted to make a course question, one that would really tie into every project cycle, and thus we could connect to most of our lessons. So we said, what's the proper role of government in a democracy? It's a great question for today, and it continues to be a great question over these past 10 years. So we created 5 project cycles: Founders' Intent, Elections, Supreme Court, Congress, and Government in Action. And all 5 of those project cycles are based on the topic outline and the expectations that the College Board sets out for success on the AP government exam. So we develop those based on standards, and good project-based learning is always based on standards and expectations that you have for students in learning. We're going to dive into one of the project cycles, the first one, which is Founders' Intent. In Founders' Intent, we still have that course master question, remember. What's that proper role of government in a democracy? And now we make it a little more specific. How do founding documents describe how our government should work? And to what extent should we be faithful to the founders' intentions? So this gives students an opportunity to talk about founding documents and also to decide for themselves to what extent should we be faithful to our founders. And you'll see that we introduce some background knowledge with that engagement first, but we really dive in right away to project-based learning, giving kids a role as a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist during the ratification debate of the Constitution. Then they'll look at a historical issue like the creation of a national bank, and they'll debate that topic as well. And then they take a time machine to the future and they have a third debate. Again, you can see that looping, the opportunity to debate issues more than one time to get better in those skills of speaking and listening, developing an argument with evidence. And in that final debate, after they've taken that time machine, they're looking at a current modern day issue and they want to decide, who has the right to decide, the national government or state and local governments. And so for me as a teacher, remember one of those design principles is teachers are collaborators. So when I go back to the classroom this year to teach this course, I am going to do a third debate, but I think instead I'm making an adaptation and I'm going to have them create a podcast. So they're going to create a podcast, they're going to have a narrator, somebody who thinks it's the federal government's decision or right to decide, and someone who thinks it's more state and local. And they can choose issues. So students will have the opportunity to decide, do they want to talk about the creation of sanctuary cities? Do they want to talk about health care? Do they want to talk about gun control? So we have a lot of opportunities to debate different topics and to really hit on key concepts But I'll tell you, if you don't give kids a role and you don't give them a public product to create, it makes it, really hard to pull them along sometimes into some of these concepts and skills. We can make school more fun, and project-based learning does that both for students and for teachers. Another example in AP Government is Government in Action. So you can see those questions at the top. How does government work together to implement public policy? And then again, to what extent? So what do you think as a student is the way that government implements public policy beneficial or detrimental? And in this case, students are advisors to an interest group. So they become kind of like a PR company where they're going to advise an interest group on the route to take. And is that route going to be to go through the courts? Or are they going to go to the president, try to get it on the agenda? Are they going to go to Congress and testify at a committee? What's their best route to take as an interest group to get their policy agenda pushed forward? And so kids have a role right away. We talk about a core issue. Usually teachers are using the issue of immigration. It's been a really great issue for us to use for the past 10 years, but people have done others as well. But it gives them the opportunity to use interest groups and understand what interest groups do, and then also understand what the branches of government do in terms of policymaking. Now, in terms of environmental science, I won't have the same level of content knowledge, but I have worked with environmental science teachers and in KIA, and so this is what we've done in KIA. In KIA, we have 5 project cycles. Their course master question is, how can we live more sustainably? And they can address that big course master question in every cycle, from eco-footprint, my community ecology, food systems, oceans in action, and negotiation of nations. And they've taken the topics from the College Board framework, worked those in, and built the project cycles based on those topics. And they've also looped through different concepts and skills. I love walking into a classroom, and I know I'm in Iowa, so this should be a surprise, I suppose, but I walk into a classroom and kids are in food systems, and they have farms, and their plots of land are often next to each other. And kids in our city haven't seen a farm, and they haven't been to a farm because we're in a pretty urban area as compared to the rest of the state. And kids have a really good opportunity to negotiate about what are they going to use on their farm to help certain plants grow? What kind of livestock are they going to have? Where do they get their water? Is it groundwater? How do I negotiate with my neighbor so that they're not putting things onto their lands that then bleeds into the water that I use? So it's a really exciting opportunity in this course in APES, or AP Environmental Science, we call it APES for short, to really get their hands in simulations and solving problems that are real world problems. And kids seem to really enjoy the course. We're diving into eco-footprint just so you can see one example of APES so that you can kind of get a feel for it. Their courses are, their course master question again is, how can we live more sustainably? But when they dive to that next level of this project cycle, it's, why does the environment matter? And how can we minimize our ecological footprint? And you can see you start with the first and work your way through, and you have the opportunity to work through 8 different tasks where you're building background knowledge, understanding the concepts and skills necessary to be successful in the AP exam, but you have a role to play. And throughout this unit, they're creating energy audits where they have the opportunity to really assess what kind of life they live and what kind of waste is produced and how they can make changes in their lives to make it better and to live more sustainably. From those deep dives, this gives you an opportunity to think a little bit about, okay, that's the curriculum design, right? But what does instruction and assessment look like in a project-based learning classroom? And it is different. First of all, there's a very real purpose for learning. And the purpose is not just the state assessment. The purpose is not just the MAP assessment or some external assessment that we are required to give, which I can find value in sometimes, but kids don't. And it's hard to get information back about where they are in their learning on those kinds of external assessments. I would rather give kids a purpose for learning important content in my class because we're doing something with it, doing something that breaks down the walls between my classroom and my community. So when they design these podcasts for Founders Intent, for example, there's a purpose for understanding the debate and the topic of federalism. There's a purpose beyond just turning in an assignment to me as their teacher, and that purpose is to educate and further a conversation that's happening outside the walls of our school. When we talk about enacting that engagement first design principle, the idea is that every time we start a unit of instruction, kids are put into roles. And we give kids voice and choice when they get to choose those roles. So if we're working into the election simulation, for example, a student might have a choice of 4 different roles they want to play. Do they want to be on a campaign team? Do they want to be a member of the media? Do they want to be an interest group leader? Or do they want to run a political party? Rank your choices 1 to 4. Turn in that note card and I'm going to put you in a team. So kids always have voice and choice, but as a teacher, I always have the ability to make sure that the teams are created, no one is left out, and that people are getting as best they can their first or second choice. Different than a traditional course, the application of content is more meaningful. We can go much deeper because kids have an interest because of the role that they're playing and the tasks that they're asked to do. So you can see a picture here from my class when I taught at Lincoln High School in Des Moines. Our AP Government course brought in somebody from our Iowa Circuit Court of Appeals to act as the Chief Justice. So when we had worked through a couple different court cases during our final moot court, we brought an expert from the outside in, call them subject matter experts, and she served as our Chief Justice and other students served as Associate Justices. And it was an amazing experience, not just for our students, but also for her as a member of the community. She was really impressed with their ability to argue a case and use the Constitution as evidence. It's always nice to have an authentic public audience, and that's really different in PBL than it is in a traditional classroom. You know, in a traditional classroom, they just turn the assignment into me, and that is great, but not very exciting. So how can you use the people in your community, parents, grandparents, people that are in local businesses or organizations to partner with you to become a subject matter expert? For example, we made documentaries in an AP US History class on the 1960s. So they covered Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement. When they created these, we brought in school board members to judge. So they acted as judges for those documentaries. What can you do to create a more authentic public audience for your kids in your classroom? And finally, the role of the teacher. Oh boy. This, you know, as we've introduced PBL to lots of teachers at lots of different levels and different contexts, we very rarely lose people. But the people that we lose are the ones who can't get off the stage. They can't stop talking, you know. And in a PBL classroom, it is different. You're going to give 10 minutes of background information and you're going to let kids explore. You're going to walk around and you're going to facilitate teams, and sometimes they're going to go down the wrong road. And as a teacher, it's hard to be okay with that. But when we fail, we learn more. Or when we make a mistake, we learn from that mistake. And we as teachers need to put our hands behind our back or sit down and not pick up their pen and let them make that mistake and give them quality feedback so that they can fix that. So those are the big shifts in terms of differences between a traditional and an AP approach. And I think now we have Jane Lowe coming in, or Sean.
Yeah, that's great, Amber. Thank you very much. That was terrific. Before we move on to Jane, we've got a quick message from our sponsor, It's Learning.
Thank you, Sean. We have been hearing some great things from Amber about how project-based learning can ignite passion and heighten engagement in K-12 classrooms. Please stay tuned after the Q&A to hear a highlight of PBL success stories from an Indiana school district that is using It's Learning to support project-based learning and manage all of the PBL assets, such as data, videos, information, lessons, and expectations. But for now, I will turn it back to our presenters.
Great. I'll now turn things over to Jane Lowe, who will talk about some of the core principles at work in knowledge in action.
Thanks, Sean. So as Amber has mentioned, and you saw in the video, these are the design principles behind our version of Rigorous PBL again. Obviously, for this webinar, we're really focused on the first 3 principles, so we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about the others. So I will spend a little bit of time talking about looping, or the second one that you see here as quasi-repetitive activity cycles. And Susan will talk a little bit more about engagement first. So to looping, or a cue rack, it really offers not just a way to drive deeper learning or allow students to revisit the ideas that you heard in the video and going back to things, but what it also does is shift teachers' thinking about how to actually organize the curriculum that they look at. So let me use the AP Gov course as an example. So if we look at this project poster again, on the top left-hand corner, as Amber has mentioned, you see the 6 major topics of AP Gov as outlined by the College Board. And it's a constant reminder to us and the teachers that there's a list of content standards and things students actually need to know in this course or for the test. And a worry that teachers might have about PBL is whether doing projects will detract from the learning of the content. Well, the course obviously is engaging, as you saw in the video, but it is also rigorous because it delivers that content or standards rather than skipping it. So how do we do this, or how is this possible? Well, this is where looping really comes in. So rather than, quote, hit it and quit it with a long list of concepts as teachers often do, or cram a bunch of concepts into individual projects, what we do is introduce students to important concepts layer by layer. Amber has given you some examples of these concepts like federalism, separation of powers, but we don't expect students to have a perfect understanding of the concepts right when they're introduced. Typically, teachers might cover a lecture or 2 on federalism, and that's it. But students find the concepts actually really confusing. So what we do in the project is actually introduce the concepts at the beginning, revisit them through the rest of the project so that students have a better understanding of these concepts at the end, because this understanding is actually layered. Each time students revisit or loop back to federalism, they build a better understanding of the concept, hence the looping ribbon that you see in this poster design. Let me be a little bit more specific as to what I mean about the other concepts as well. So our approach to content is not to omit it or minimize it for the sake of the projects, but rather to organize it so that content fits logically into the project. It's really about relationships. We work with teachers to identify main concepts of the course, as Amber talked about, and build lesser important concepts around them so that by visiting and revisiting the main concepts, students will understand it really well, and also to pick up on the lesser concepts along the way. A couple of metaphors work with this center to periphery idea. The first is the trunks to branches. So if you think about introducing students to the trunk of a tree multiple times, they will likely pick up on more nuanced qualities about the various branches through each visit. Or by focusing on individual posts of a fence and how each post connects to other posts, students get a fuller picture of the entire fence at the end. And lastly, kind of our favorite metaphor is by asking students to focus on a solar system and its sun. So they're bound to pick up on relationships between the sun and its planets rather than studying individual planets one at a time. The idea here is for students to revisit the most important ideas multiple times, while along the way, actually they pick up lesser concepts with it. So rather than going through a long list of all of the planets, when you study one solar system, you kind of learn about everything in that solar system multiple times along the way. But because students are learning about all of these concepts in relationship to one another, they're actually more likely to remember them and remember the importance of all of these concepts. So back to an AP Gov specific example. So this is a poster that we have not looked at. This is an example of the SCOTUS or Supreme Court project that we do. In this project, students are focused on learning major concepts like judicial review or selective incorporation. So rather than assigning a long list of court cases that students have to memorize, we organize the court cases into each task of the project. So for example, in the first task, students are asked to conduct a trial court. This is actually a place where they do their experiential dumping. Students often mistake appellate courts or appeals courts with trial courts. So by allowing them a space to kind of put all of their prior knowledge about trial courts, teachers can help them differentiate between trial courts and appeals courts later. And then when we move on to task 2 or 3, students conduct a series of circuit moot courts where they're assigned to roles as lawyers and justices. So in task 2, they might argue a case like Schneider versus Phelps, which allows them to learn peripherally about precedents as well as freedom of speech cases like Lemon versus Kurtzman, or where we established a Lemon test, or Schneck versus U.S., where a clear and present danger formulation was set on the limits of freedom of speech. So by focusing on one or a few important cases in one project, which takes about 2 to 3 weeks, students are actually learning peripherally about a lot of cases, as well as the precedents that they set for their current moot court case, and how these cases actually impact issues like civil rights and civil liberties. So teachers have an option of doing this once or twice in task 2 and 3, or they can do the appeals a decision directly to task 4, which is a moot Supreme Court. And by going through that actual process of how a court goes through the appeals process, or how a case goes through the appeals process rather, Students also learn about how the process actually works. And I know this is a lot to take in and you probably have more questions, but essentially what we're saying is we figured out a way to organize these big concepts in a way that students need to know and in logical ways so that the content actually fits better together and make the projects more relevant for students. And our data has shown that this process covers the content, meaning teachers and students have both reported feeling like they really get through the material, and our studies have also shown that students do as well on the AP test as similar populations of students who do not do projects. So meaning their test scores don't suffer from this. So we think this process really works in driving content and learning together through projects. So now to Susan to talk a little bit about environmental science as an example for engagement.
Hi, thanks, Jane. So when we designed the AP Environmental Science course, we had some different challenges. The Gov class started as a half-year course and it went to a full-year course. We took a full-year course and did project-based learning for the full year. And so we had to really pay attention to how to find the cross-cutting themes across the different cycles that would lead to coverage of the material that they needed for the AP test, but also provide opportunities to deeply learn the content. And so that was kind of an ongoing battle that we think we've pretty much won. So although the people have asked about whether the individual cycles can be used by themselves, and they can, but there's some baked-in features of the course architecture that help both deepen the learning and promote engagement. So one you've already heard about from Jane is looping. We also, when we talk about engagement first, part of that is setting a purpose for every kind of learning that they're doing and assigning roles at the beginning of each cycle so that students know who they are and what the purpose of the learning is. With environmental science, we had an extra challenge because the content of environmental science is really depressing. And so the first year that we implemented it, we got a lot of pushback from the students saying, oh, wow, this is just really depressing and it's really interesting stuff, but we can't really do anything about it. And so it's really so they started to disengage because they really couldn't see a realistic role for themselves in addressing any of these problems. So we redesigned the course to build very carefully from local to global across the year of the course. And so you lose some of that when you pull projects out and teach them one at a time. So we started with Eco Footprint, which you've heard a little bit about, where students analyze data from their own homes and figure out what their family's ecological footprint is, and then they, over the course of the cycle, learn how to develop a proposal for reducing the impact of their family on the environment. And then they present those proposals to their families and report back on that. It then expands outward to looking at their local community, then outward farther in a simulation task on the food system, which I'll talk about in a minute, broader even to ocean systems, and then finally to a negotiation of nations, which is where they represent countries in a global climate summit. So the food cycle, I'll tell you just a little bit about, if I can get my slide to come up. Let me try this again. There we go. Okay, in the food cycle, they start by learning a little bit about where their food comes from. So they actually bring food into the classroom and they source it. So that's where they figure out their food shed. Then they're put in their roles as farm designers, and their task is to develop a farm for crop production that can be sustainable for 5 years. And they have to consider ecological issues, and they also have to consider economic issues and social and cultural issues when they design their farm. So they start out, they pick their crops to fit the climate, they design their farm, and then we start giving them a series of challenges, so it becomes kind of game-like. the first challenge is the pest invasion. So now they've got pests and they've got to figure out how to develop a sustainable pest control strategy for their farm. The next challenge is we show them who their neighbors are. They're each other's neighbors. And because they've all picked different ways of growing their crops and different kinds of pest control, there are naturally occurring conflicts that happen between neighbors. They also have to deal with selling their product, and so they have to deal with the demands of their buyers, which we give to them. And then they also, in the final challenge, they have to deal with a drought. And so now they have to look at their water supply system. They've got to negotiate again with their neighbors to figure out how they're going to use the limited water supply, whether they need extra water for their crops or not, depending on the kind of crop that they have and so forth. And then finally, in the wrap-up, they reflect on their role as consumers in influencing the way people put their farms together and how sustainably we grow our food. So here's a picture of one group in one of our schools, and they are in the middle of neighbor negotiations. So we've said, here are your neighbors, and they're looking at, oh my gosh, I've got this GMO-based corn farm right next to my organic corn farm. What am I going to do? And I'm going to be doing overhead spraying of pests. Well, that's going to get into the water supply, and I'm downstream from you. And so they have to negotiate that and make modifications at each step to address the challenges that we give them. So they get really engaged with this. This is fun for them, and it gives them a real reason to go back and find out more information all the time about what it takes to grow food. So just to wrap this up, I want to talk about what we found in the portion of the study where we were studying particularly the environmental science course. This was funded by NSF. We found that to support engagement in PBL, you need to frame the task appropriately, frame the project, frame the activities that they're doing by making connections to the past, their past learning, their past experiences, and future learning, but also how are they going to use this out in the real world. And also, they need help and support, which we build in some, but teachers play a big role here in helping students really take up their roles. For example, the farm designer role that I was just talking about. We also have developed a number of what we call material tools to support engagement and to support formative assessment. For example, we developed an argument development tool that students use collaboratively to develop arguments for and against citing industry near their community. You saw the use in that picture of the topographical map. That was a big regional map that had all their farms in it that they had to use then to figure out not only what the problems were, but what potential strategies were for dealing with conflicts. We also spent a good amount of time helping students learn from text. What we found was that teachers and students collaborated in avoiding text as much as possible. In these classes, teachers tended to assign chapters as chapters. Kids tended to skim them for the vocab, and that was about it. And so we developed some strategies and worked with teachers for changing that. One of those was setting purpose for reading and then following through, okay, you read this stuff, now you have to use it to solve this problem that I'm going to give you today, for example. And also chunking the reading assignment so that the reading was so the reading matched the purpose that you were giving the reading for. So instead of assigning a whole chapter, it's look at pages 200 through 210 to find out this stuff that you need for tomorrow. And so we spent a lot of what we did in our task figuring out ways to implement the curricula that we had designed in better ways. And so that's where we're going to stop and turn it over for questions and answers.
Great. Thank you, Susan. That was really enlightening. Before we go to the Q&A portion, I just want to put up the results of our poll, which we gave the audience earlier today. basically the question was, what do you see as the biggest challenges teachers face in using project-based learning strategies in classrooms? There you can see the results. And just a reminder that this presentation will be archived later, so you're welcome to go back and look at the results at any time. We've had several questions come in along this theme, and so Susan, I'll put this question to you, and then Jane and Amber, you're welcome to weigh in if you want. But someone in our audience is asking, how long does it take to successfully plan the PBL course? I don't know if there's one answer to that, but do you have any sense of that, Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I can only tell you what our experience was, and it was part of a research project. So it's a little bit different. But similar kinds of things I've heard from teachers who've done this in groups in their schools on their own. It takes, you have to allow a significant amount of time to really dig into the course and what you want them to learn. Think about what possible projects might be that would help you address those learning objectives. That takes some time. So what we found was it took about a year to plan a course collaboratively with others. Now, that said, what people have done and what we've done as well is start test driving projects during that year to see how they're working, to see whether or not our ideas are on the right track, and then feeding that back into the course design. And then you teach it once, and you see all the problems with it, and then you revise it, and then it becomes just like any other teaching. You teach it, you revise it, and you improve it.
Yeah, I'm sure, as with many teachers have experiences with other courses, as soon as you have the plan down, it's more a matter of refinement from there. So
right.
Yeah.
But having the design principles from our work, I think, is really helpful to teachers in doing this work themselves.
Absolutely.
I was just going to that. This is Jane. To add on to that, in Florida, we're actually doing a similar thing because, as Susan pointed out, the AP course was a Gov course in Seattle was a year long, but here in Florida, it's a semester long course. So I've been working with teachers to really figure out whether or not this is going to work just as well in a semester long course. And the preliminary answer is yes, but working with those teachers to develop a curriculum, I think, went a lot smoother, given that we had the design principles already developed from the Knowledge and Action project and some sort of like a template to go off of, and so the design process went a lot faster and smoother, I would say.
We have a question that came in from someone in our audience. He's asking, I'll pose this to Amber, but Jane and Susan, feel free to weigh in. He's asking, is there a number of projects that would be completed in a semester class or year-long class? Or maybe a better way of asking, is there a percentage of time that is project-based, while another percentage of time might be spent in more traditional teaching and learning? Amber, do you have any sense of that?
Sure. There's no rule. But in my estimation, when I work with teachers and we design projects for 7th grade social studies or 8th grade science, we're really thinking about a project cycle running between 4 to 6 weeks. That's what we try to aim for, is a project cycle between 4 to 6 weeks. And every single week in almost every class period, we're working on that project. And so we think about how do you change and bring in some of your traditional methods so that they support the project. So my kids don't know a lot about the role of a political party and how they write a platform. So I might give them a 10-minute lesson on that, but I'm not going to give a 45-minute lecture on the role of political parties. I'm going to give them 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'm giving them a challenge to go complete or a task to solve. So the idea is that there is not one rule. It's really about what feels right to you, but if projects are the spine of your course, then you really want to drive the learning through those projects, which means kids have a role at the beginning to play, and they're working towards creating a public product at the end or solving a problem, a real, authentic, real-world problem at the end.
Great. Thank you. Jane, I'll pose this question to you. And I'm going to assume from the question that this comes from a teacher. He or she's asking, when you make the groups of students, do the same roles exist within each group, or is each group distinctly different from each other? What would be your response to that?
That's actually a really, really great question, and at least in the AP Gov project or in the AP Gov course, that differs from project to project. So especially at the beginning in Founders Intent, we do put kids in similar roles, and so in Founders Intent, all of the students are playing roles as delegates to the Constitutional Convention. So they might play individual different characters, but they have a similar role, so that students can kind of learn how to do that role together. Now, when we get into elections, however, the kids are in different roles, and the teachers will tell you it's a bit of a five-ring circus because there are kids who are presidential candidates, and there are kids who are interest groups. There are kids who are playing the role of the media. So there are multiple different roles that kids play. That said, when the teachers, at the beginning, it could be a little bit daunting to kind of manage all these different groups. But once teachers sort of get used to it and understand how the project works, the various groups actually helps with different kinds of grouping. So you could have a day when like the media group talk together about a media plan. You have the candidates getting together to powwow and other things, whereas on a different day, there's kind of cross-grouping that happens where the media is interviewing different presidential candidates or the interest groups are talking to the political party leaders. And so so I guess that question sort of depends. Depending on what the project requires, the roles kind of come out of that. And, having similar roles have its positives and negatives. Similarly, having multiple roles also has its challenges, but also its benefits.
Here's a question I'll pose to Susan. A member of our audience is asking, is there some central resource that is being used to share projects developed by others and to support teachers in how they might implement these projects? I guess this person's asking about, is there any kind of central repository of types of projects that's being organized, or is it more sort of school by school?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know of any depository as such, but there are a couple of places to go for resources. One is our website, knowledgeinaction.org, which has where you can request access to our curricula, and you get more information about the design principles and some video tutorials on them. Then the Lucas Educational Research Foundation is running a big national project that they've developed a really good web-based platform for teacher collaboration across sites. And they are getting ready to launch a new group of teachers as fully supported with a mentor and access to the curriculum and so forth. And so you can get information on that through our website as well about how to contact them. But there's no reason why you couldn't do this, or that a group or a state or a district couldn't do this.
This is Amber.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to jump in too with just highlighting the Buck Institute for Education. It's at BIE.org, and they're well known for their project-based learning support. They do a Pbl 101 opportunity or training for teachers, and they have a ton of resources on their website for people that are looking to get started. And when we started creating the AP Government course, we looked at what Buck Institute had done and took some of their ideas and some ideas that other teachers had to kind of give us like a place to start. And so it might trigger something for you as a teacher, no matter what course you teach. Go to their website, you might find some ideas there.
And also, just to add on, Edutopia has a whole section on project-based learning as well, and that's also a part of the George Lucas Educational Foundation. So there's lots of other resources for all sorts of different courses on project-based learning at Edutopia.
Just one other question. We've had some questions from our audience come in about what's the role that instructional coaches can play, I assume, in getting teachers up to speed on how to implement the Knowledge in Action program in districts. How is sort of knowledge spread from teacher to teacher? Is it by instructional coach in this program, or what would be the role of sort of teacher mentors in helping getting their peers up to speed on how to implement this? I guess I'll pose this to
Amber's probably the best person to answer that because they've been doing a lot of this work in their district. But the thing to remember is this is not a program in the sense that you do it, everybody does it the same way no matter where you are. It's a set of curricula and design principles that districts and teachers and groups of teachers and departments can use to design or develop or modify what we've done, and their own ideas. And so, Amber, why don't you tell them a little bit about what you've been doing in Des Moines?
Sure. So when I transitioned from a teacher to a curriculum coordinator role when I moved from the Seattle area to Des Moines. And so initially, I went out and talked with teachers in environmental science and government and said, would you be interested in learning more about this project-based approach? If so, we can get you some training. And so at that time, we were working with the George Lucas Foundation. We were able to get some training for those teachers. But we've used these design principles, just like Susan said, in lots of courses, in U.S. history, in 7th grade social studies, in 6th grade social studies. I mean, we have trained tons of people on how to develop their own projects, and we've really done that, in my case, through district PD time. So we might have early Wednesday release where teachers get together in teams and they're working in a PLC, and they might work on one, being supported through learning these project-based learning design principles, and then they get together and they start to create. Then my job is they send me feedback or they send me their plans and I can send back some information about what I'm thinking, or ask them some questions. But it's really, I mean, teachers as professionals can definitely do this together. I think instructional coaches can help by asking questions like, is this aligned to standards? How are you going to do formative and summative assessment? What kinds of strategies do you want to use to engage students and access prior knowledge? But I think really it's about taking those design principles and then as a professional, kind of thinking about your goals in the end and how you make that come alive for your students.
Great. We're at the end of our Q&A time allotment. This has been terrific, and just a reminder that our guests have put up some links to the websites with more information on this project. I'm now going to turn things over to our sponsor, It's Learning, for a quick message.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you to all of today's presenters. As I mentioned earlier, I'm highlighting the Bartholomew Consolidated School Corporation. It's a one-to-one school district in Indiana that is using It's Learning to support project-based learning and manage all of the PBL assets, such as data, videos, information, lessons, and expectations. The PBL curriculum at BCSC provides many opportunities for students to work cooperatively and demonstrate their learning. It's Learning is the hub that facilitates communication and collaboration, creation, reflection, student voice and choice, and organization of projects, as well as their associated lessons and assets. The project-based learning programs at Bartholomew Consolidated School Corporation serve as a good example of how technology support for PBL starts with a modern, centralized, and standards-aligned learning management system. Please feel free to visit our website at itslearning.com to learn more about how a teaching and learning platform can support project-based learning.
Great, thank you.
Back to you, Sean.
Thank you. I'd like to remind you all that if you want to watch today's presentation again, an on-demand archive will be made available through edweek.org within the next 24 hours. And you can also visit edweek.org to find articles that explore project-based learning and related topics. Thanks to everyone for listening in today, and a special thanks to Amber, Jane, and Susan for the discussion. We hope that we've offered some ideas for implementing project-based learning in your schools and districts. We'll catch you next time.